A panel of think tank scholars, policymakers, and business leaders will discuss how COVID has helped think tanks understand the value and importance of partnerships and to research across geographic and ideological boundaries to forge new and exciting partnerships. The panelists will provide examples of effective bilateral and multilateral institutional partnerships and joint research projects and programs. May I please welcome the following panelists to the stage, and as I say your name, please be seated right under your name. If you don't mind, let me start with Dilawar Ala Eddin from Iraqi Kurdistan. He's the President, Middle East Research Institute. Brian Finlay, the President, Stimson Center, United States of America. Dore Gold, President, Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs from Israel. Marlos Lima, Director of International Affairs from Brazil. Stormy Annika Mildner, the Executive Director, Aspen Institute, Germany. And ladies and gentlemen, this session is going to be moderated by the Chair, Akchai Maathur, Director and Head of Geoeconomic Studies Program, Observer Research Foundation from India.
Go ahead.
Mr. Akshay, I think we are a bit behind schedule. You'll have your time. You will have till 4:15.
Can I bring the conversation back to the panel here and ask Mr. Dore for your opening statement on partnerships and think tanks?
Sure. Let me just open by thanking the chairman of the board of Darasat, Sheikh Abdallah, for continuing this innovation of this operation. But also, I didn't know Jim McGann. I see references to him in this conference, and I think we had one Zoom meeting with him a week before coming here. And many times in life, you have those moments where you go, gee, I wish I had known this guy. But I hadn't, and I think he has helped enormously with the, I would say, deepen the conscious awareness of people of the importance of the bodies that we lead. Just as a matter of introduction, I have been in the position of being in and out of government for a number of years, sometimes serving in the government of the State of Israel, and sometimes outside it, but operating as the president of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. And that gives me a kind of unique perspective to see, so what do these think tanks do? Do they really help? Can they really do something the government can't do? And in those maybe 20 years or so, I learned the special advantages of think tanks and what they can contribute to our shared interest in seeing greater stability, greater understanding between states and peoples. And I firmly believe that think tanks can continue to make a difference. First of all, when you're in a think tank, as opposed to government, you don't require the approval of the political leadership when you are pursuing some new course of action. If it fails or leads to embarrassment, well, you're out of business. But if it doesn't, if it leads to a breakthrough, if it leads to some new understanding, you can bring that to your government contacts and they might adopt it. And for that reason, the think tanks have a kind of unique position they're in for this kind of work. On the other side of your contacts, let's say a government with whom you don't have diplomatic relations, your country doesn't have diplomatic relations, wants to sort of check out a potential contact with your side. Well, if it's a think tank, he's got deniability. Because as we know, there's an active journalistic world out there that is always trying to find out, did Israel actually talk to the Libyans? What happened there? So the deniability factor is also very important for allowing people, governments, all kinds of entities to have contact with one another without committing officially their country. We're sitting now in Bahrain. And Bahrain is a signatory to the Abraham Accords, one of the latest really revolutionary developments in Middle Eastern diplomacy. And I have to say, I tremendously appreciate the leadership of Bahrain in this area, and I want to congratulate them. But there are a number of countries in the Gulf and in the Middle East who haven't joined the Abraham Accords. Some of these countries actually have had some kind of diplomatic contact with Israel. We used to have an office in Muscat in Oman, but Oman hasn't joined the Abraham Accords. But let's say there are countries like that which hope to explore a new relationship with Israel, with a new set of understandings of how we should operate in the Middle East. They can reach out to us and to others through think tanks. And if the think tanks weren't there, they wouldn't pursue that option. So I believe that that's a very important feature that the think tank world brings to Middle Eastern diplomacy now, in the past, and in the future. I can tell you this, personally in 2015, we had contact with a research center in Jeddah. It was small, but it was the first of those kind of contacts. It wasn't official. And it was tremendous, it was of tremendous use to both sides. I'd like to say how today different parties are also communicating in the kind of new world that we have. One thing that the current situation with COVID has done, it's brought a boom to the industry of Zoom. And so you can understand that Zoom is one way of circumventing the whole issue of, oh, do I have to get my vaccine updated? But Zoom can also be a way of reaching out to populations where you don't have a way of having diplomatic contact. And one of my people in the Jerusalem Center brought us into dialogue with tribal leaders in Iraq and in Syria, even though no diplomatic relations. And we were able to talk, we were able to exchange ideas. They put proposals out, and I found it to be amazing. They spoke in Arabic, our people translated, and it was a very positive experience. We can always bring those experiences back to our political leaders if there's something to show, if there's something to share. And that's what we did in most cases. I also want to say one other thing about what this kind of contact can eventually do. One of the problems Israel frankly has is that while it has these great humanitarian instincts, it wants to reach out to its neighborhood. It wants to reach out to the peoples around it. It's many times blocked by the political realities that we have. And what I saw was, even in cases where we have diplomatic relations, let's take with South Africa. We found that many of the special technologies which we could bring to South Africa, which would improve the situation of water for the South African population, were simply blocked by the sensibilities of the ruling party there. We also found, and this is a period when even before I was in the Director General's seat of the Foreign Ministry and afterward, that you could reach out not only to the governments of certain countries, you can reach out to the populations. For example, I went to Johannesburg in 2016 and met with the chiefs of the main tribes of South Africa, like the Zulu tribe. And they were interested in obtaining Israeli water purification technology. So I think that
Excuse me, you have one. You have to wrap up in 1 minute.
Okay. So I think that, first of all, coming sometimes as an entity which is not an official government entity, and coming with our, what we have to offer the world is something which is helpful for Israel, it's helpful for our potential partners, and last but not least, I have to mention that our medical capacities in Israel have been steadily improving over the last few decades, so that when our diplomatic relations improved in West Africa, we helped bring the teams that dealt with the spread of Ebola in that area. So I think that, A, the state of Israel wants to be more active, more involved. Two, we have a problem of political warfare, which I don't want to get into, but it's there that has prevented that. And three, to the extent that think tanks can help lower the barriers between the state of Israel, its neighbors immediately contiguous to it, and its neighbors further away, it can bring about a new reality for many people and help us make a contribution.
Thank you. Part of the reason of attending these meetings is not just to be able to coordinate how we disseminate each other's work, but also get to know about each other's work to begin with. Stormy, I know of the contributions you have made to think tanks as well as business chamber, because you were B20 Sherpa, you were with the business chamber in Germany, and you've been with think tanks, so you have a dual hat, so to say, or at least that kind of experience. Are we in line with the kind of collaboration governments and businesses are doing? I often feel like we are a step behind in that kind of international cooperation. So sometimes think tanks actually end up in meetings or with policy views which are actually less informed than what governments are doing or what businesses are doing to begin with. But I'd like your view on this.
Indeed, I switched sides several times in the last 7 years.
Just hold on 1 second.
Try again. No.
It's okay, we can hear you. It's all right.
And just not so sure if everybody else can hear me.
Maybe it's the business chambers that are just cut you off. Oh, okay. It's still not working? Okay. So maybe I'll come back to you, Stormy. Marlo, why don't we come to you? You've spoken a little bit about the associations that you have done. So perhaps tell us, because you were talking about like that association, and you've talked about how you have tried to internationalize the universities and the academic collaborations. So maybe what has worked there and what did not work? Oh, it's not working either. Is it just my mic that's working? I'm really flattered that you that you think that you want to listen to me, but we're.
Maybe we can ask questions.
Yeah, I know. We need to. Mr. Dore, is it working for you? The mic? Can you?
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Yes, it's working. All right. So maybe we go with you, sir. Tell us a little bit about your experience with advice that you get when you were in government, because you were in government and think tank, but when you're in government, you're getting advice from business and think tanks both. And where have you found the think tanks to do really well in the kind of advice that they give versus, say, others, say, business or other interest groups that come your way?
Well, I don't know about business and interest groups. I just have seen that if, you know, in a changing world, you need new ideas in order to address the challenges you face at a given time. And the new ideas can run up against conventional wisdom in your own country or in the neighboring countries. It becomes hard to implement it. But if a think tank puts forward the idea, it can, of course, suggest a course of action that would make the idea more acceptable. I'm speaking very abstractly, so it's very unsatisfactory because I can't disclose a lot of things, but I firmly believe that think tanks are an important vehicle for getting new thoughts out there. I mean, one of the big things that happened, this is not related so much to the whole COVID crisis, you know, Israel has become a regional hub, and I mentioned it before, in the medical field. If you go to Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem, go to Ichilov Hospital in Tel Aviv, Rambam in Haifa, you'll see patients there from all over the Arab world. You'll also see doctors that are Jews and are Palestinian Arabs, and you know, it's not the Middle East that you're seeing on CNN. Or when Israel developed a kind of military clinic on the Golan Heights, which serviced the Sunni population in Syria that had been affected by the Syrian civil war. So I think that role, we have huge medical infrastructure. It has only grown in recent years. That has to be built up, exploited in a way that will help the region. And I think Israel is prepared for that, and Israelis are prepared for that. Why would Israeli doctors run, as I said before, to West Africa to deal with Ebola unless it was in their sensibility, unless it was part of their idealism to try and help the world in those areas? So I think that has to be built up, and I think the benefits for, first of all, the Middle East region, and then for regions that are around us could be enormous.
Okay. Is your mic working now?
I think it is.
Okay. So you want me to repeat the question to you?
No, I think I do remember. First of all, I wanted to share the experience in a couple of projects which we initiated, which picks up on some of the points which have been said, and that is the exchange between think tanks also within our own countries. What we created this year, a colleague of mine from SWP and I, is something which we called Director's Cut, where the president's directors of the think tanks meet with each other on a regular basis to talk about the challenges. And in the beginning, it was kind of stiff, but the more and more we do it, the more we exchange really what we are worried about, because it doesn't make sense to make the same mistake 3, 4, 5 times, but to learn from each other. But then we have to overcome this competition thinking, and also lay open our vulnerabilities and what we know we are doing well and maybe not so well. I can really recommend that. It's sometimes a little bit of a painful experience, but it really, really helps. The second what I wanted to exchange or to talk about is that the channel relationship between business, think tanks, and governments. I think we need to increase our knowledge and understanding in all directions, how we work and how we think and what our cultures are. And we cannot do so by just writing wonderfully empirically based papers and handing over a paper. So we made really good experiences with, for example, role plays. where we invited think tankers, government representatives, and business representatives to play through a global challenge and then see what can be learned from each other in that process. For example, we simulated the EU-China summit, and big learning experience, I think, for everybody. We didn't create any new empirically founded knowledge, right? But the understanding we created, that was really immense. And we also did something dissimilar from this, but with the same effect. And there was a scenario workshop on the future of Europe, where we also brought together different groups and worked through different future scenarios. So I really think this is a great way to build relationships, also of trust and understanding, so that we do have a channel through which to communicate our findings better, our recommendations better. And last point I wanted to share is actually from the Business 20 and the Think Tank 20. As you mentioned, Akshay, I was responsible for the German B20 process under the German G20 presidency. And one of the big differences between B20 and T20 is the degree in organization, I would say. So very similar, both have the working group, the streams, on very similar topics. Big difference, however, is in the Business 20, there is one recommendation paper coming out of each stream, and this is where then the power is placed behind. In the think tank, there are about 15, 20 papers coming out of each individual working stream. Wonderful papers, but I'm not so sure how many really read them outside our own community. And there is not as much, I would say, behind the individual or the consensual recommendation. And I think if we were trying to consolidate a little bit what we are finding and putting this out there with a little bit more forcefulness behind this, joining together, I think we might increase our impact.
Okay, thank you. Marlo, we want to move to the Q&A, but I want to give you the last word here. Maybe perhaps something short and quick on...
Sure. Thank you for your question. Yes, I think the academic world has a lot to do with the think tank work. Of course, we can always hire the right people for the right place, but even in larger organization, and the organization I work for is not a small one, the importance of the alliances is huge. And your question was, does it work? Well, it depends on how asymmetric the relationship is, and how we can manage this asymmetry. I can give you an example, a very simple example. In 2012, we started a digital, what we call Democracy Digital Room. It's an initiative between 9 think tanks. And it didn't work for 2 years until someone from Colombia said, okay, listen, I'm going to pay for everything. And suddenly the others say, oh, are you? So that's fine, I'm going to pay too. And now we are talking about 7 countries since 1912, and it works. But it depends on how we manage the asymmetry.
Thank you so much. With that, we'll open up to Q&A. My takeaways are Brian's talking about collaboration should be organic. Dore talking about let's take the big ideas forward. Dore talking about that we still need independent, genuine ideas for the future. Stormy talking about scenarios and simulations. And Marlo talking about taking initiative. So with that, let me look at the room. Yes, the lady right there. Please go ahead.
Hello, thank you. It was really interesting to listen to this panel on partnerships because that was actually one of the main topics we discussed already last year during the fabulous town hall meeting initiative which Jim started at the onset of the pandemic. And Paolo Magri and I, we were co-chairs of the working group which was exploring how think tanks should adapt and change in the wake of the crisis. And the topic of partnerships was a reoccurring topic. So I invite everybody here who maybe was not involved in that process at the time to check out the website of TTCSP and download the Working Group 5 report, which actually contains some very interesting examples of partnerships and ideas and proposals for partnerships, not only between think tanks, but also think tanks with civil society organizations, with the business sector, etc., etc. So we discussed all different sorts and forms of partnership. I'm very happy to have heard the intervention from Ms. Stormy. Our institutions actually have collaborated for quite a while now, and Aspen Institute Germany is, I think, our biggest and most important think tank partner in Germany. Actually, I think that is a very good form and a very good example of a partnership which has been around for quite a few years, and where I think we have already made quite a significant impact through our collaboration, because we had, I mean, for us as think tankers from the Western Balkans, from all 6 countries in the Western Balkans, the fact that we had an institutional partner in Germany that offered us and provided us with a platform for discussions with German policymakers and advocacy efforts was extremely useful. My only concern is what happens when Aspen Institute Germany loses its funding for this specific project. And that is one really, really pertinent issue, because some amazing initiatives and very fruitful initiatives come to an end when project funding ends. And when they're project-based, that kind of makes them, you know, it gives them an expiry date. So how can we overcome this, and what should we do in advance and on time to make sure that these kinds of, you know, really proven and high-quality initiatives and partnerships, that they don't die out the moment a project ends? Thank you.
Maybe we take, would it be okay if we took one or two other, that one I think, Stormy, you can start with when we get to the answers, but that's one. Yes, sir.
As I was listening, as I was listening to Dore, and you talked about regional areas of focus and concentration to create more dialogue amongst regional think tanks, we obviously have various regional summits through the TTCSP program. But then as we think about what Stormy talked about in terms of a code of conduct, which has come up repeatedly, what seems to me is that there is a risk for having a kind of fragmentation if there's not some coordinating agency to provide some guidelines and structure for those regional deep dives, if you will, to bring the various think tanks within those respective regions together. So what advice would you suggest to avoid fragmentation, meaning one region having a different code of conduct based on geopolitical, cultural, social, economic interests that would avoid the fragmentation of the program itself and the think tank community from a global perspective?
Thank you, sir. Anybody else? Okay, maybe Stormy, why don't you start with that, and the others are also welcome to add your answers. Go ahead, Stormy.
Thank you so much for mentioning that project. It's one of my favorite ones, and you are so right. I mean, actually, it does keep me awake at night right now, because we do face huge funding problems, and it becomes really problematic, because as soon as you set up a really, really good and well-working program which is funded by a foundation, or also maybe by the government in part, as this project is, if the foundation decides that it wants to discontinue the project, you will not find another foundation picking it up, because it's so branded with that one foundation. So it becomes we have it over and over at Aspen, Germany, that problem. We have a really great project, then the funding ends, and then we don't find any continuous funding for it. And I really don't have an easy solution for it, apart from how we try to work around it, is by rebranding and reframing, trying to bring the project to a different level, giving it a little bit of a different perspective, and then trying to continue with it. And that's something we are trying to do with this project as well. But you are absolutely right. It's a huge challenge, and I'm probably right that many of you are facing the same issue. And if you're more funded by the government, and in part we are, then if you are running, I mean, we are facing a huge problem right now with not having a functioning government yet, not having a functioning budget. And so if the foundation is gone, if the government money doesn't come, if you have limited resources from companies, that model becomes very, very difficult very quickly.
And I think embedded in her question was also this insight that with collaborations and partnerships, also you have to share risks of the program getting discontinued. So your partner may have ended up hiring resources, investing in capacity building, even promising to their policymakers or their ecosystem that a certain paper or a project is underway, and therefore there's risks to be shared on both sides, which comes along with it.
And responsibility. I mean, there's huge responsibility as well. So we are now looking into EU institutions and looking at partnerships to apply for new grants. But it's I think it's throughout doing a project, you really need to start thinking from the beginning on what if, and trying to answer the if earlier on. And not just at the end of the project thinking, oh dear, what are we going to do next?
Marlo, you want to answer?
Yes. I just want to testify. My organization was founded as a government think tank 76 years ago. And 30 years ago, a new president stepped in, and he turned to us and said, okay, thank you very much for your collaboration, but you have no budget anymore. At that time, 30 years ago, we had 2,000 people working for us. We had to fire 700 people, and go to the market. So maybe talking about the future of the think tank, as Aaron said in the other panel, the change of the model, the business model of the think tanks, we passed through that 30 years ago, and we're still alive. Now we actually are bigger than we were 30 years ago. It involves a lot of changing the way we think, the product and everything, but it's possible, just testable.
Brian, do you have anything to add on this question?
Yeah, it's a really important question that has been raised from the floor. I mean, for us, and I suspect for everyone, we all struggle with this question. And I think the key really is diversifying our funding. I mean, for us, it's not just good governance; it's good business to have multiple funders for a single project. And so, the kind of the vicissitudes of the marketplace and the particular donors that may be fickle and jump in and out of particular themes or projects with their investments. We make ourselves, I think, resilient. And in many ways, I mean, this is the right panel to be having this conversation, because I think partnerships really are key to that diversification. Our donors or our partners, rather, in country and foreign countries are attracting a very different subset of contributions than we are here in Washington or in Brussels. And so, those partnerships in some ways kind of reinforce that business resilience, so that when one particular donor may, pull back or recede, others are already in place to support our work.
Very good point about business resilience. Clearly, obviously, even in business, corporations and firms face this all the time, and this is the kind of continuity planning is embedded in any corporate thinking. So I suppose that's something that we should incorporate. Did you want to add? Can I move to the second question? Did you? Okay. So second question.
Well, the second question, if I can start from this, the best way I think answering is that we as a community, or what you say think tank, which is a very loose term, is not really an institutionalized set of highly structured organizations that you can, like universities, you can name them under one, and then each government, each institution would design their code of conduct and then how they should and introduce measures on their output, quality measures, ranking, and so on. So you cannot really compare any of those. What I see is a pool of organizations, ranging from being some of them one-man show, tiny, very sort of loose, all the way to government, it's like embedded in the Foreign Office, embedded in a university, embedded any other, so you can see how rigid or how flexible they can be. But as a whole, we call them think tanks because they tend to have that notional thing in common, that they all deal with policy or they deal with evidence-based recommendations, or there may be a minimum definition. So we really cannot apply the same rigidity as in universities on think tanks. We cannot judge any two think tanks by the same standards. So the best thing when it comes to sustainability, when we talk about sustainability, again, we cannot do anything about it. When the pool moves forward in time, maybe individual organizations, maybe large numbers at any one time will drop out, new ones created, and so on. So the pool will continue. They look as big as ever, but they actually they change in terms of the membership and component and the types and so on all the time. We cannot really go back and impose a structure or institutionalize something at the global level. Most of us are registered as NGOs, and we abide by the law of the land that is applied to NGOs, and others to government, and our accountabilities are to the law of the land. So what I would, however, say in terms of code of conduct, we need to be careful and not to put them in the same kind of categories. When it comes to ranking, this is a very important area that is affecting everyone's what do you call branding or marketing, as well as ego. I would say it has a lot. This ranking system is so important, it's so critical and so sensitive and complex. This is one that needs criteria. This is one that needs code of conduct, as well as measures how, criteria how to measure success. So if I understood the question right, is that really there's nothing we can do about sustainability other than leaving the pool to carry on, evolve its own way, and we cannot apply the same rule on all.
Anybody else have a response to that? Okay, are there any other questions? Yes, Aaron, go ahead.
Thank you, Akshay. I wasn't going to ask a question, but then I realized, Akshay, you and I had a 3-year partnership together. I remember saying to Marlos before the pandemic, let's work on something cool together. And he's like, yeah, and it didn't even matter what it was. We just wanted to work together. And Brian, we were talking about doing some stuff at the UN together. So my question is this, we've got this network built, but a lot of it's personality driven and relationship driven. So do you see any way to make it more institutional so that it survives changes in leadership, or are we bound to kind of live in this world where it's based on the strength of relationships that people have?
I'm probably being handed a note to shut this down. Okay, thank you. Who's that directed to? Sorry, Aaron?
Brian.
Anybody want Marlo or? Well, let me start because you mentioned my name and that partnership that we were engaged in for 3 years. I think what worked really well is that we knew it was a track 1.5 dialogue or a track 2 dialogue, and that we had a certain responsibility that we could talk and talk about issues that the government was not talking about. It is something that was mentioned here in the panel as well. 2, that it was a partnership of equals. Each side brought their resources, brought their experts, and jointly discussed the ideas and disseminated jointly, collectively disseminated the ideas to the policymakers on each side. And number three, I think it created a history, a documentation, a body of work, which for 3 years, that partnership with 10 papers remains in the public domain for students and the public and government officials to refer to. And I think that's what really worked. And
Can I make a comment, please?
yes, please.
Something has sort of become very clear to me in the course of this discussion, and that is, you know, there's a whole industry out there. There's the think tanks. I served as Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, so there's the UN world. But the greatest progress, particularly in the areas of international peace and security, which might not be what everybody's interested in here, the greatest progress was made, well, we used to say this, the sons of the region, when they took it upon themselves to study, make suggestions, and speak to their national leaderships about the suggestions they were putting forward. That really made a pivotal change. And you have to be very careful that you don't just create this like endless machine of recommendations that may not change people's lives very much. But I think when we, the people of the Middle East, do this and take responsibility for all facets of our international intercourse, I think that we can alter our region.
Okay. I think with that note, I'm sorry, I know Stormy and you both have something to add, and probably Brian does as well, but I have been given a note, and we know that we have to run on schedule, so